Alice gazed out the window of the grand estate, her thoughts a mix of fleeting satisfaction and something less defined. The sprawling gardens outside seemed to stretch endlessly, the manicured hedges and vibrant flowers a symbol of the life she had built, a life that was carefully crafted, perfectly polished. Yet, despite the picture-perfect surroundings, she couldn't shake the emptiness gnawing at her from within. She glanced down at her phone, a message from Marcus lighting up the screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I'll be there at 7. His words, so innocent, so full of love, felt like a weight pressing on her chest. She had convinced herself, for the time being, that she loved him, but deep down, she knew the truth. Her feelings for Marcus were something much darker, a desire for control, power, and the luxury his wealth provided. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from James, her younger brother. "He really believes you, doesn't he?" The words made Alice smile, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was one of amusement. "Yes," she typed back, "he's so eager to please. It's almost pathetic." She hit send before setting the phone down on the polished wooden table beside her. The laughter that bubbled up from her chest was more bitter than anything. She had been calling Marcus a beta paypig behind his back for months now. She hadn't meant for it to go this far, but the power she held over him was intoxicating. He was so desperate for her attention, so willing to do anything to make her happy, even though she hardly showed any interest in him. She had manipulated him into thinking she was his perfect match, the woman he'd been searching for his whole life. Alice stood up and walked over to the mirror, inspecting her reflection. She had always been the image of Grace, the woman everyone wanted to be. The perfect fiancée, poised and beautiful, the embodiment of wealth and privilege. She adjusted her hair, smoothing down the delicate strands of blonde that framed her face, before turning to head downstairs. The engagement party was tonight, and she had a role to play. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus was waiting for her. His face lit up when he saw her, as if she were the only thing that mattered in the world. The way he looked at her made Alice's stomach churn, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "You look stunning," Marcus said, stepping forward to take her hand. She allowed him to kiss her on the cheek, his touch soft and gentle. There was a time when she might have felt something, when she might have allowed herself to pretend she cared. But not anymore. She had moved on, and he was merely a tool to maintain her lifestyle. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne and forced laughter. Alice spent most of the time exchanging polite pleasantries with the guests, pretending to care about their lives while silently calculating how she could use them to her advantage. But through it all, Marcus remained by her side, ever the doting fiancé. She felt a flicker of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by annoyance. He was too easy. Too predictable. Alice had always known that she could control him, and she reveled in it. But as the night wore on, she started to feel something she hadn't expected: doubt. What if he found out? What if he discovered how she truly saw him? The thought was absurd. Marcus would never figure it out. He was too blinded by his infatuation with her. Later, when the party had died down and the guests began to leave, Alice found herself alone in a quiet corner of the estate with James. He was lounging on one of the velvet couches, scrolling through his phone. Alice joined him, taking a seat next to him. "Is everything going according to plan?" James asked, glancing up at her with a smirk. "Of course," Alice replied, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Marcus is wrapped around my finger. He's already planning the wedding, the honeymoon, all of it. He's too easy, James. I don't even need to try anymore." James raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "You really don't care about him, do you?" Alice's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "He's useful. That's all." James chuckled, shaking his head. You know, you're kind of a terrible person. Alice shrugged. I don't have time to care about feelings. This is business. For a moment, James stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. Just be careful. Marcus isn't as blind as you think. Alice's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Nothing, James said quickly, raising his hands in mock surrender. I just don't want you to get caught up in something you can't control. Alice rolled her eyes. I've got everything under control. But as she looked at James, she couldn't shake the unease that was slowly creeping over her. Something wasn't right. She pushed the thought aside, convincing herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Alice found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions. The guilt gnawed at her, but it was overshadowed by the exhilaration of power. She had the perfect life, the perfect man, and no one could take it from her. She had worked too hard to get here. But even as she reassured herself, a small, lingering doubt took root in the back of her mind. What if Marcus found out? What if everything she had built came crashing down? She shook her head, banishing the thought. Marcus would never figure it out. Not in a million years. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was about to change. The weekend getaway was supposed to be a reprieve from the bustle of their high society lives. Alice had agreed to the trip with a casual air, thinking it would be a perfect opportunity to further entrench Marcus into the idea that they were a couple destined for each other. The secluded estate where they were staying had been in Marcus's family for generations, an enormous, ivy-clad house nestled in the woods, away from the prying eyes of their social circle. They arrived on Friday evening, greeted by the scent of pine trees and the soft crackling of a fireplace inside. Marcus seemed delighted by the change of pace, his excitement palpable. He smiled at Alice, his eyes filled with anticipation. He couldn't wait to have her all to himself for the weekend. But Alice had no such enthusiasm. She was simply playing her part, continuing the charade that had kept her in this comfortable position. The moment she stepped into the house, she felt the familiar coldness of her own ambition tightening around her chest. The first night was filled with small talk, wine, and laughter that felt rehearsed. Marcus hung on every word Alice said, oblivious to the growing distance she felt from him. She could already see the way things were unfolding, how the weekend would go. They would share a couple of nice dinners, enjoy some walks around the estate, and then return to their normal lives as though nothing had changed. It was a perfect plan, one that would keep Marcus happy and content, while she continued to control him from the shadows. But the next day, things took a different turn. Marcus had gone out to explore the grounds, leaving Alice in the study with her thoughts. She had just finished sending a quick message to James when she heard the front door creak open, followed by footsteps echoing through the hallway. She was standing by the window, her back to the door, when Marcus spoke. Alice. The sound of his voice made her pulse quicken. Something in his tone was off, and she couldn't quite place it. She turned, casually tucking her phone into her pocket. Marcus. I didn't hear you come in. He was standing in the doorway, looking at her with an unreadable expression. His jaw was clenched tightly, his posture tense. There was a coldness in his eyes that Alice hadn't seen before. Is everything all right? She asked, trying to sound nonchalant, though her heart rate had begun to quicken. I need to ask you something, Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with an edge of something darker. Alice's stomach dropped. There was no pretending now. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. She forced a smile, trying to maintain control. Of course. What's on your mind? Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Earlier today, I was out by the garden, and I overheard something. Something unsettling. Alice's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the heat rising to her face, her body tensing involuntarily. She knew. She had been caught. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. I heard you, Alice. You were talking to James. You called me a beta paypig. You were laughing about it. Is that how you really see me? The words hit her like a slap in the face. For a split second, she stood frozen, unable to process what he was saying. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way to undo the damage. But there was no way to take it back. The truth had been revealed. Marcus, she stammered, but her voice caught in her throat. There was no way to explain herself out of this. He raised a hand, silencing her. No. Don't try to justify it. I know what you think of me. I thought I was enough for you. I thought I meant something to you. But you've been playing me this whole time, haven't you? Alice's heart pounded in her chest. The words were too harsh, too direct. She had always thought of Marcus as someone weak, someone easily manipulated, but now, as she looked at him, something had shifted. The power dynamic between them had crumbled in an instant. Her instinct was to lash out, to cover her tracks with venom, but something about the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't angry, he was hurt. Deeply hurt. And that was far worse than any rage he could have displayed. Alice, he continued, his voice quieter now but no less intense, I've done everything for you. I've given you everything I have. And this is how you repay me? By calling me a paypig? By using me like I'm nothing more than a walking wallet? Her chest tightened, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of guilt, a brief, sharp pang that she quickly suppressed. She couldn't afford to feel that now. She had to maintain control. I didn't mean it like that, she finally managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. It's just how I talk with James. You know how brothers and sisters are. We joke around. Marcus's face hardened. Joke around? You really think I'm that stupid? Alice took a deep breath, stepping back from him. She could feel the walls closing in around her, but she couldn't let him see her falter. She had spent so long perfecting this act, and now it was unraveling. I'm sorry, she said, her words slipping from her lips like they were nothing more than empty pleasantries. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was a stupid joke. That's all. But Marcus wasn't buying it. He looked at her with a cold, calculating stare, and for the first time in their relationship, Alice realized she no longer held all the cards. I need some space, he said, his voice low but firm. I need to think. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Alice standing there, staring at the door. Her body felt numb, as though the weight of the situation had taken everything from her. She was alone now, truly alone, for the first time since she'd met him. She sank down onto the chair by the window, her mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had carefully constructed this entire facade, and now, in a single moment, it was falling apart. She could hear the soft hum of the wind outside, the creaking of the old house settling around her. The walls that had once felt so solid now seemed to close in on her. For the first time, Alice wasn't sure if she could keep the lie going. The silence in the house felt suffocating. Alice sat in the chair, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the empty doorway. The conversation with Marcus had shattered something inside of her. She was no longer the one in control, no longer the one pulling the strings. For the first time, Alice realized how thin the veneer of her carefully constructed life had become. The walls she had built around herself were cracking, and she had no idea how to stop it from collapsing entirely. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was hard to tell. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the only light in the room now came from the dying embers in the fireplace. She glanced at the phone in her pocket, wondering if she should text James. But no, she couldn't. Not yet. She needed to fix this first, needed to regain her grip on the situation. The idea of admitting her mistake to anyone, especially Marcus, felt impossible, but she had no other choice. She stood up, moving to the window. The night was deep now, and the estate lay still, bathed in moonlight. It was beautiful, in a desolate sort of way, but it didn't calm her. Nothing did. Her mind was racing, trying to come up with a solution, a way to undo the damage she had caused. But no matter how much she thought, the same painful truth kept coming back: she had messed up. Badly. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps outside the room. The floorboards creaked under the weight of someone walking slowly, deliberately. Alice's breath caught in her throat as the door to the study opened again. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face still set in that hard, unreadable expression. But there was something else there now, something that made her heart drop, a sense of finality, like he had made a decision and was no longer looking for her approval. "I've been thinking," Marcus said, his voice calm but cold, "and I can't keep pretending anymore. I can't pretend that everything is fine when I know it's not. You're not the person I thought you were, Alice." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of it was still a shock. She had spent so long cultivating the perfect image of herself, using Marcus as a means to an end, that the thought of him seeing through her was unbearable. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. There was nothing left to say. "Do you really think I'm that gullible?" Marcus continued, his voice growing firmer now. "That I wouldn't eventually figure it out? The way you've manipulated me, used me, it's all been so clear, and yet, I kept fooling myself into thinking I was enough for you." Alice felt a tear slip down her cheek. She hadn't cried in years, not since she had learned to bury her emotions beneath layers of lies and manipulation. But now, in this moment, she couldn't stop it. She had failed. Not just with Marcus, but with herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. "I never meant for it to go this far." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stood there, staring at her as if he were waiting for something more. But Alice had nothing left to offer. She had played her hand, and now the game was over. "I think it's time for you to leave," Marcus said softly. There was no anger in his voice now, only a quiet sadness that pierced through her heart. "I can't be with someone who sees me like that. I can't be with someone who doesn't love me for who I am, but only for what I can give." Her heart shattered at his words. She had known this was coming, but nothing had prepared her for the finality of it. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was in control, that she had everything figured out. But the truth was, she had never truly understood what it meant to love someone, or to be loved. And now, she was facing the consequences of that ignorance. "I don't want to hurt you anymore," Marcus said, his voice distant. "You need to leave. And I need to figure out who I am without you in my life." Alice stood there, frozen. The man she had spent so much time manipulating, the man she had once thought she could control, was now the one calling the shots. She had no power left, no way to fix this. For the first time in her life, she was faced with the brutal reality of her own actions, and the consequences they had brought. With a final glance at Marcus, she turned and walked out of the room, her mind numb. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what she would do next. All she could hear in her head was the sound of Marcus's voice, saying the words that had shattered her world. "I need to figure out who I am without you." The walk out of the house was almost mechanical, as though she were on autopilot, her legs carrying her away from the place she had once thought of as a sanctuary. She didn't care about the estate, or the life she had built with Marcus. Nothing mattered anymore. She had lost it all. Outside, the cool night air hit her face, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could hear the distant rustle of leaves in the wind, the chirping of crickets in the trees. It was peaceful here, but it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. She had tried to bend the world to her will, to shape it to fit her desires, but in the end, the world had rejected her. And now, she had nothing. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do next. The house loomed behind her, a cold, imposing figure in the darkness. There was no turning back now. She had burned every bridge she had ever built. As she walked away, she couldn't help but think of James, of the messages she had sent him earlier. She had thought he would be the one to catch her when she fell, the one to pick up the pieces. But now, she wasn't sure she could trust anyone anymore. She had made her bed, and now, she had to lie in it. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Alice was no longer the person she once was. And she would have to figure out who she really was, without Marcus, without the lies, without the game. For the first time, she felt truly alone.